Thank you very much, Professor Pezzini, for extending this invitation to me. And thank you very much for coming today. I know it's the last term. You all are very, very busy. So much appreciated. It's at the end of a very exhausting term that you're coming to attend this lecture. Maybe a kind of a comment on what I'm doing. I'm presenting a talk as I would present it to a kind of a general audience. So as if you were my students. I know that, of course, the members of the Tolkien Oxford network are not on the level of students. So please bear with me. Maybe it's also just kind of a cultural exchange of how I or how we on the continent teach to some extent. We don't have a scripted talk. I will try to keep to the time. I have as a Swiss, I have an inbuilt watch. But I'm to some extent I'm flexible, and that flexibility maybe leads me sometimes a bit astray. But that's possible again. It's part of my presentation culture. I know when I talk to my French or American colleagues, they often have very carefully scripted talks. Sorry, that's not what I do. Yeah. Okay. Let's start. I give you first kind of a general introduction. Then we'll have a look at the setting of the scene, the landing point, the Shire. We'll have a look at in depth, the Shire. And then we'll go beyond the Shire, what I call New Horizons. We'll have a look at a few other phrases that are of importance. And then I come back to my initial thesis statement, and I will conclude with some concluding remarks. And then we have time for Q&A before we finish. You see, the didactic drive is already there. So now we talk about places and people. There is this kind of old joke that when God created the perfect place, somewhere near the Mediterranean, rich farmlands, nice climate, rain just in the right amount, perfect. And then the surrounding countries said, hey, wait a moment, that's not fair. You've given them everything. And God said, yeah, just wait what kind of people will live there. Just wait. And I think we know all places like that. So a good place to live in does not automatically mean good people, and good people maybe not automatically mean a good place to live in, even though there is a bias that the two go together. Now, starting with the creation myth. When looking at Tolkien's creation myth, the music of the Ainur, there we see that the creation of his world is not the finished product, but actually it's an ongoing process. So that means we can, as inhabitants of this world, or his protagonist, can influence how it develops. So it's a kind of a ongoing process. And that, of course, is quite important to remember. We don't have a fixed state, but it can go for the better or it can go for the worse, but it can also be healed if it has gone wrong one time, as we will see. I have three thesis statements that are kind of related to each other. First, that space is important in the battle between good and evil. So the conflict does not take place in an abstract vacuum. The second is that the habitat, the place where people live, characterizes the people. And it's especially obvious with the hobbits of the Shire. That's why I take them as an introductory example. And third, that the relationship of the protagonists with their habitat is an indicator for their moral attitude. So generally speaking, I would say that morally sound characters interact positively with their surroundings, whereas negative characters are mostly without either a proper homeland or have an obvious tendency to damage or pervert their surroundings. Let's see how this plays out in Tolkien. And by the way, I'm not quite sure we're going to kind of provide the files, otherwise you're welcome to take quick notes now. Some of the key publications on that topic. I want to talk maybe first about analogous concepts to what I've called like land, like people. We do have this concept, which maybe what they could read is the kalos kayagatos.
Kalos kayagatos.
Yes, basically you're what you look. So yesterday when I went out for a late dinner in Oxford, if I had met the gentleman to the left here, I probably would have felt a bit apprehensive. If I had met the lady to the right, I probably would have thought, okay, what have I eaten? But you are positive experience. So you see that. Speaking of eating, there is a similar concept. You are what you eat. I'm not quite sure whether bronze is that or yeah, but it's a kind of a makeshift. I don't think it does exist, but since we have Alagagatos, I thought, okay, it would be nice if we had a Greek term for that too. You are what you eat. And that runs through the entire Lord of the Rings, especially since we have Hobbit protagonists. You know, Sam is carrying his cooking gear all the way up to Mount Doom. Well, he ditches it actually before actually climbing Mount Doom, but all the way into Mordor. And we have this kind of memorable dialogue between him and Gollum about how to prepare rabbit. Sam, of course, wants cooked with taters, and Gollum prefers rabbit a la sushi. So, and I wrote a paper in 2013 on Levi Strauss in Middle-earth. You know, Levi Strauss has drawn the cooked, and I tried to apply that Levi Strauss concept to eating habits in Lord of the Rings. We could have a third concept, which I didn't mention here, but I'm supervising actually a PhD at the moment on conlands. And the researcher is having a look, what are the associations with the different conlands? You know, how do they sound? What are the different people associating it? Why does Elvish sound nice? Why does Orcish sound not so nice? And similar things. So we do have a similar kind of relationship also in how the people speak. Right, that was, whoops, that was the introduction. Wait a moment. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm up. Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, I'm a Mac person, so I'm completely lost with PC. We come now to the setting of the scene, namely the Shire. The Shire is, of course, the landing point for us readers. Tolkien invites us into his wide world via the Shire. It is basically our homeland in Middle-earth, and from there we then explore the wider Middle-earth. The Shire is basically an idealized countrified England. As an outsider, I simply kind of agree with that, what basically Tom Shippey claimed. We see it also in the history of the Hobbit migration that Tolkien consciously constructed parallels to the Anglo-Saxon migration. We'll have a look at that in a minute. And of course, the landscape and the geographic position also suggests, especially Warwickshire, Oxfordshire area. And then we have, of course, of this modernity. So the Hobbits, they are basically Edwardian in culture, pre-industrialized, idealized Edwardian culture. And the names also play an important part. We'll have a look at some of those elements in detail now. I mentioned that the Hobbit migration into the Shire, the three tribes, the Harfoots, the Fellowhides, and the Stores, of course, parallel the immigration by the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes in the 5th century into Britain, which then turns into England, England. So probably the Hobbit migration was more peaceful than the Anglo-Saxon and Jutish migration, even though there has been a of that and now no longer called the Anglo-Saxon invasion. But I'm not quite sure what is the foreign state, what's the current terminology? Anglo-Saxon migration, probably, something like that. Yeah. Then the Shire is England. I think the landscape, whether it is as it is shown in the movies or described by Tolkien himself, is typically, prototypically English. Even the name, the Shire, which means a unit of administration, is typical. It's not Worcestershire, but it's the Shire. And we have a nice problem how to translate that into the other languages. The French go for La Comté, and the Germans have an interesting selection, das Auenland, the county of meadows, the meadow county. Now, Tolkien in his letters commented on the problem because the equivalent, the cognate to that would be, the correct translation would be der Gau. And of course, those who know a little bit of German history, der Gau, know that der Gau has too much of a connotation with Nazi Germany. You know, we still have it like in Aargau, Allgäu, you know, as kind of a compound, but der Gau itself is a no-no word in Germany. And so you cannot have the Shire translated der Gau. Then we German speakers would think all little Nazi, you know, kind of all the Nazis running that. So they had to go somewhere entirely different. And das Auenland, I think it's well chosen terminology. The Shire, with its dimension and with its placing in the northeast of Middle-earth, within Eriador, matches Tolkien's desire for the climb of the northeast of Europe. He said he wanted to kind of create stories and tales for his readers with that kind of flair, with this kind of air of the northeast of Europe, not the Mediterranean, said, and probably also not the far north. That's something different, but the northeast. And we see, of course, the placement of the Shire in the northeastern part of Eriador. And if you kind of overlay a map of Europe, we have a few hints. For example, Minas Tirith is more or less on the level of Florence, he says. Then you can argue that the Shire actually matches the Oxfordshire Warwickshire area. Very frequent. Here it is, yes. There are different models, different maps you can find on the internet. I've chosen the one, of course, that supports my thesis. But yeah. The names. Also, Tolkien pays great attention to names in the Shire. He has familiar names like Bag End, No Bottle, Gamgee, Baggins, Buckland, and even exotic names are adapted. So instead of Baranduin, Buck, you have the Brandybucks. So this exotic name, Baranduin, is basically adapted into the Hobbit context. And we can say that within the Shire, you find only good English names. So they are basically all of Anglo-Saxon origin. And only when you leave the Shire proper do we have more exotic names, mostly Celtic, and then later on, of course, Elvish and other names. If you're interested in the topography and toponymy of the Shire, there is the standard study by Rainer Nagel, Hobbit Place Names, a linguistic excursion through the Shire, who tells you everything you want to know and you don't want to know about the place names in the Shire. Now, we not only have place names that either really do exist in real world England, like, for example, Buckland, I think that's southwest of Oxford somewhere, or Newbury, somewhere in Berkshire. There, or Brocken Borings and Frogmorton, you don't find them actually on an English map, but they could. It's very, very likely that you could have a place like that, sounding like that. But what Tolkien also does, he introduces archetypal landscape. Bilbo lives in a place called The Hill. And it is, as I pointed out before, the Shire. It's not Hobbitonshire or something like that, but the Shire. We have the water, the marsh. And this archetypal featuring, Tolkien commented on already in his On Fairy Stories, where he said that Fairy stories, they present you often an archetypal landscape. I quote him, "If a story says he climbed a hill and saw a river in the valley below, the illustrator may catch or nearly catch his own vision of such a scene. But every hearer of the words will have his own picture, and it will be made out of all the hills and rivers and dales he has ever seen, but especially out of the hill, the river, the valley, which were for him the first embodiment of the world." That's what he actually does. Now, Tolkien was, of course, also a philologist, so he paid attention to the language. And I'm not quite sure, do we have a native speaker from Oxfordshire or Warwickshire? Okay, if not, then you have to bear with me. I'm sorry for all the mistakes I'm making, but I try to get the main points across. The talk at the Ivy Bush, we have Gaffer Ganji talking about the upcoming birthday celebrations, and of course about Frodo's relationship with Bilbo and about his parents who died. And Gaffer Ganji says the following: "A decent, respectable hobbit was Mr. Drogo," that's Frodo's father, "Drogo Baggins. There was never much to tell of him till he was drowned." So, as I always have to tell my student, drowned is not really a standard form of English. Goes on, "The Sackville Bagginses won't never see the inside of Bag End, or it is to be hoped not." So, double negation, a normal feature in dialectal speech, but not in standard English. And a stranger, but obviously also from the Shire, joins in when they talk about the silver and gold hidden away, presumably in Bag End, and jewels, by what I've heard. So jewels, non-standard pronunciation of jewels, like that. Now, Tolkien in this does something that Shakespeare did, that D.H. Lawrence did, that Thomas Hardy did. They use dialectal markers, not kind of full transcript of dialectal speech, but some salient markers to indicate these people are speaking dialect, even if that's not 100%. And we have enough dialectal markers to actually match this dialect of the hobbits to real world English dialects. And that's what in 1997, Professor Johannesson did. And guess where he ended up? He ended up here in this area, Warwickshire, Oxfordshire area. So even on the level of dialect usage, Tolkien made sure that the Shire matches the Oxfordshire, Warwickshire area. So we have a cultural match, we have a geographic match, and we have, you could say, a dialect linguistic match. And Tolkien, being Tolkien, he liked his low philological humor. So knowing that the hobbits speak a certain dialect, you are aware that Sam, when he discusses the sighting of walking trees at the Green Dragon pub, there has Hal reported that he saw a walking tree, and then some of the other hobbits say, "Oh, I don't believe you," kind of probably he has seen something else. Maybe he has just seen a tree in the fog. And then Sam says the following: "But this one was walking, I tell you, and there ain't no elm tree on the North Moors." Now this N, eight, you have to pronounce it in the proper Oxfordshire Warwickshire dialect, it's N. Okay, that's page 58 in my edition. Now, 430 pages later, we meet trivia of Philologus of old. And when the hobbits telling him their names, he said, whoa, don't be so hasty, because there are ents and ents, or there are ents and things that look like ents, but ent, as you may say. So he obviously is a very astute dialectologist. He picked up, oh, that's the way they speak. So I make a phonological joke. And Tolkien, kind of said, okay, my readers, they will remember, 440 pages ago, there must have been this. Yeah. That's Tolkien. Now, after having established the Shire and England as this kind of landing point, Let's have a look at how the hobbits and the Shire interact. We get to know in the introduction that hobbits love peace and quiet and good till earth. A well-ordered and well-formed countryside was their favorite haunt. So it's kind of civilized nature, tamed nature. That's what they like. And the key kind of feature here is growing food and eating it occupied most of their time. And of course, if you're doing that, you don't have time for big politics, stuff like that, wars and all that. And this relates a bit to what Tolkien, one of the unpublished letters to Arthur Greaves, wrote in 1930 when he was thinking about his modern life. And I think it's still true. He said the following: family life must have been different in the days when a family had fed on the produce of the same few miles of country for 6 generations. That perhaps was why they saw nymphs in the fountains and dryads in the wood. They were not mistaken, for there was, in a sense, real, not metaphorical connections between them and the countryside. So basically, they had the countryside inside them, and the countryside had them inside. You know. What had been earth and air, and later corn, and later still bread, really was in them. We, of course, who live on a standardized international diet, I mean, that's 1930, are artificial beings and have no connection, save in sentiment, with any place on earth. We are synthetic men, uprooted. The strength of the hills is not ours. Of course, you could say that for the hobbits, the strength of the hills, or the hill, is in them. They are part of this closed cycle of birth, growth, death, and decay. That's true. Tolkien presents being the Shire and the hobbits, you could say, a perfect ecosystem, independent. But of course, this need not always have been so, and not always be so. And he gives us a timely reminder by reminding us that the hobbits were in fact sheltered, but they had ceased to remember. Later on, of course, we are introduced to the Dunedain, who protect the borders. And also, when Frodo and his friends encounter Gildor, he says, "But it is not your own Shire. Others dwelt here before hobbits were, and others will dwell here again when hobbits are no more. The wide world is all about you. You can fence yourself in, but you cannot forever fence it out." So Tolkien undercuts this kind of self-contained utopia that he has just created. He makes us aware it can change. It has not always been so. Maybe it won't be like that in the future. So, as a conclusion of the first part, we can say that the Shire as a benchmark or as a landing point becomes the norm, becomes a benchmark. As a reader, we accompany now the hobbits outside the Shire, and basically we measure everything that we encounter with Shire standards. Or at least that's the implied measurement that we take. We come to new horizons beyond the Shire. The first one is just immediately beyond the Shire. I said the Shire is fenced in, but you cannot fence things always out. And the fence that protects the Shire to the east is, of course, a real fence, a living fence, the high hay, this hedge. And beyond that is the old forest. And the old forest, you could say, is untamed wild nature. And as such, as we know also in our world, if you do not tend the meadows and the pastures, well, sooner or later, the wood takes over. You have saplings, trees, and then it's wood, forest again. And that's what the old forest did, and the hobbits actively had to push it back. So there we have the first conflict between the hobbits, who love nature but controlled, tamed nature, and untamed wild nature, wilderness. And Old Man Willow is, you could say, a personification of the old forest. He's an ambiguous figure, but nature is given personhood in that. From a Hobbit perspective, of course, he plays a rather negative role, but via the Tales of Tom Bombadil, they also begin to understand, to have a deeper knowledge and a deeper understanding of the old forest. So it's a kind of a beginning of an education of hobbits and hobbit readers if we come with this naive mind to this novel. The next encounter and the next experience that widens our horizon is Bree. Now, Bree is a mixed settlement. Have big folks and small folks, so meaning hobbits and men. And also the architecture is mixed. The Prancing Pony is an example. They have kind of rooms that cater for hobbit tastes, and they have normal, we would call it, rooms for men. And also linguistically, we move now in a more exotic area. We have now suddenly names like Bree, Chet, Archet, and so on that are of Celtic origin. And as if you start out in Oxfordshire and move west towards Wales, you suddenly have also these mixed names, because Bree Hill, of course, is this typical mix-up when an Anglo-Saxon coming in asks a Celtic native, what do you call this? And of course, he wants the name of the hill. And the Celt thinks so. He wants to know what a hill is and says Bree. And so this misunderstanding, and then the Anglo-Saxons call the hill Bree Hill, because they think Bree is the name of it. And the same with Chet. Chet also means wood. So Archet, well, is Chetwood would be wood, like that. But the feeling that reader kind of steeped in Oxfordshire, Warwickshire landscape is it's getting more exotic. It's not yet Elvish, but it's definitely no longer the Shire, no longer the homeland. However, the food is good. Sam, no. The home-like Sam said the food is home-like enough to dispel the last of Sam's misgivings, already much relieved by the excellence of the beer. There, the concept is you are what you eat kicks in. So that's good food. They can't be bad. We move further to Rivendell. Rivendell is one in a series of homely houses where the hobbits stay and then have to leave again. Oops, again. Here. It's okay. I think I'm an oops. No, sorry. Sorry. Be more careful. Thank you. Yeah. Rivendell is the perfect domestic place, as Bilbo pointed out, whether you like food or sleep or storytelling or singing or just sitting and thinking best, or a pleasant mixture of them all. Merely to be there was a cure for weariness, fear, and sadness. Rivendell functions as an archive in the story. We have, of course, it's the setting of the Council of Elrond. And already Elrond, he is an embodiment of lore and tradition. When he says, yes, I know, I remember, Gil-galad and all that stuff. Yeah, of course, I'm several thousand years old. What do you think? I've been there. And it also shows up in the feasting. We have first the feast, and there it is interesting if you compare how Tolkien describes a feast and a later fantasy writer like George Martin describes a feast. In Tolkien, we have the feast, and he says the food and drink was of the best. And then they move on into the fire, and you have 3 pages of poetry. Bilbo, the song of Earndel the Mariner. In Martin, you have about 1 page, a detailed description of the menu. And then there was also song and poetry. You can guess where the different authors put their preferences. We move on via Holland to Lothlorien, and In Holland, we have an example where the landscape remembers. There, the elves dwelt, and elves obviously seem to have a very symbiotic, very strong link and relationship to the landscape. And Gandalf gives expression to that. He says, there is a wholesome air about Holland. Much evil must befall a country before it wholly forgets the elves if once they dwelt here. And we see that, of course, in perfection in Lothlorien later on. So they're on the way to Lothlorien. This is like a kind of an announcement of what is to come. And Legolas gives his famous kind of memento, only I hear the stones lament them, deep they delved us, meaning the elves. Fair they wrought us, high they builded us, but they are gone, they're gone. They sought the havens long ago. But still, basically, the landscape remembers. And just another example of the landscape remembers is Ithilien. I jump a bit, but it belongs into this category. Ithilien, the garden of Gondor, is now a little bit of a disheveled garden. And we have some orcish mischief. For example, the statue of the king has been decapitated, and the orcs put a garish kind of head in place of the king's head. But as Sam points out, the king's head, who lies on the ground, has now a wreath of flowers. And Sam points out, look, the king has got the crown then. So here, the landscape kind of predicts what is going to happen with the return of the king with Aragorn. So here, the landscape not only looks back into the past, but actually, to some extent, looks forward into the future. I've already announced it. Lothlorien is the best example of a synthesis between people who live in a place and a place, and they become basically one, or at least for the people looking from the outside. The Galadrim, they live in the trees, they live with the trees. You think that, kind of almost that they are trees, but we have the ends for that. That's different. And that's why when Frodo asks Sam about the elves, he says, well, I reckon there's elves and elves. They're all elvish enough, but they are not all the same. Now, these folk aren't wanderers or homeless. So again, homelessness is a kind of an indication that something is off, that something is morally wrong with you. And seem a bit near to the likes of us, but they seem to belong here more even than hobbits do in the Shire. Whether they've made the land or the land's made them, it's hard to say, if you take my meaning. And this symbiotic relationship is also shown in the produce of the land. The lembas, it's not just whey bread, cram, something like that, but it has almost a spiritual dimension. And the cloaks that are woven, because Galadriel says, we have put our love for water, air, and earth into these clothes. It's not magic, or at least not in the Elvish understanding, but it's a visible product of this symbiotic relationship between the environment and the inhabitants. Of course, we do also get some negative examples. Mordor. The name itself spells bad news, Old English for murder. There is no food. There's no permanent settlements. It's an industrial wasteland. Sorry? Oh, sorry. There was a feedback. Yeah. And it's hostile to life. So it's the end product, you could say, of a development that started with Isengard just now. With Isengard, we have first, you could say, a harmonious synthetic environment where we have an orchard, we have trees, and then Saruman starts to industrialize things. And of course, we get a little Mordor then when Gandalf and the Ents revisit Isengard after that. There is, of course, also hope in the fate of Isengard because the Ents, they bring the trees back. So it's possible to reverse that process if it hasn't gone too far. And it shows, of course, it is the visible expression of the moral decay of Saruman. I mean, if I were Gandalf and riding, as he describes, riding into Isengard, riding into this last set, I would say, hey, wait a minute, this is not a good place to be in. But Gandalf seems to be a little bit obtuse at that moment, and he rides in anyway. Decay can also be slow and gradual, and we have this in Minas Tirith. There we don't have a driving force like Saruman. It's more a letting go. Also in Denethor, you rather commit suicide than stand up against the enemy. And here too, as a symbol of that, it's the dead white tree. And of course, as a renewal of the kingship with Aragorn, we do have also the replanting of the white tree by means of a sapling that he found on Mount Mindorlowy. So there again, the revival of growth and the revival of trees is an important symbol. And that, of course, brings us to the coda, the discovering of the Shire. For time reasons, of course, Peter Jackson omitted discovering of the Shire, but it is to some extent very important in the structure of the novel. It's a coda. It's like in Mozart's Il Barbiere di Sevilla, where we have, in the end, kind of the marriage of the nobility, and we have a kind of a subplot where we have the lower classes also in the end having a happy end. So you could say this is a similar thing. We have a happy end with Aragorn and Arwen marrying and kind of restoring Arnor and Gondor to all its glory. And then the hobbits come back and they find also their little kingdom in disarray and they have to restore it, and they do it. So it's a kind of a repetition. This musical term coda fits very well of what we have seen before. So it's also a reminder, as I said before, that the Shire is not per se a perfect utopia, but it has to be preserved. It has to be protected. You have to put some effort in it. And of course, again, trees are a symbol that Sam, when he plants this malorn nut that we have, the malorn tree replacing the party tree as such. Come to a conclusion. I hope I have kind of illustrated my thesis statements, namely that space is very important in illustrating the conflict between good and evil, that the habitat characterizes its inhabitants, and that the protagonist's relationship with where they live is basically an indicator of their moral attitude. As Professor Pettini already said, if you want more on Tolkien, there is this conference on Saturday in Zurich on Tolkien and leadership. It will be also online. So you simply write an email to at the webpage into this form, and you will be sent the link to the Zoom. We have international speakers like Matthew Dickerson, Claudio Teschi, Judith Klinger, people like that. So you're most welcome also to attend there if you have a little bit of time on Saturday. But otherwise, thank you very much for bearing with me. Hope you're still awake and time for your day. Thank you.